After the Union victory in the American Civil War, settlers began to pour into the West, lured by offers of cheap and fertile land. There was only one problem. The interior of the continent belonged to large and powerful Indian nations. While white settlers poured onto the prairie, planting crops and grazing cattle and sheep, the American military sought to contain and subdue the Indian nations. Concerned that a war of extermination was immoral, President Grant in the 1870s introduced a peace policy, herding Indians onto reservations, where through education and missionary work, they might be indoctrinated into the white way of life. By the early 1880s, conditions on the western reservations had become deplorable. As money meant for Indians was pocketed by corrupt administrators, people on the reservations died malnourished, homeless, and dispirited. The scandalous treatment of Native Americans was so bad that white reformers pushed through Congress their own solution to what had become known as the Indian problem.
For American Indians, a law passed in 1887 would change their lives very dramatically. Congress passed a law that was called the Dawes Act, which tried to break up tribal land and allot land individually to Indian families.
People used to tell me, you look in one direction and as far as your eyes can see, and from there as far as your eyes can see, and from there as far as your eyes can see, in any direction. That used to be our land. Now we're, subjected to parcels, and this parcel has been checkerboarded, so we're isolated from one another.
When land was allotted to people individually, rather than held collectively by a tribe, then it really was an attempt to undermine tribal identity, to get Indians to think individually as Americans, not as Arapaho or Cheyenne or Sioux.
The subdivision of tribal lands under the Dawes Act left millions of surplus acres that were sold off to white settlers and investors. The money the government made from the land sales was supposed to finance Indian education. But what would be taught, and who would teach it?
Education should see the disintegration of the tribes and not their segregation. They should be educated not as Indians, but as Americans. Thomas Morgan, Indian Affairs Commissioner.
But while they were going through that process, they were also detribalized. They were told that their values were not very good, that their way of life was no good, that they had to become Christians, that they had to become members of the white society.
Only generations later would Americans rethink the morality of this final attempt to erase Indian cultural identity. The Plains Indians did not give up without one last effort at resistance. Out in the western mountains, the Paiute prophet Wovoka had a vision that dancing Indians would gain strength from their ancestors and set off natural disasters that would cleanse the West of the white intruders. The ghost dance movement spread across the West, alarming the American military. When groups of Lakotas fled their reservations in the winter of 1890, the U.S. 7th Cavalry tracked them down, and on December 29, 1890, massacred 300 men, women, and children at a creek called Wounded Knee.
Something else died there. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream. Black Elk.
The massacre at Wounded Knee dealt a final death blow to the Plains Indians' way of life.